Hi, adventurers. If you're seeing this message, it must mean you're on a quest of some sort, and perhaps in need of some resources to aid you. I'm sure you know as well as I that game development is a journey. You go through so many phases. Those loose weeks throwing spaghetti at a wall and squinting at the shapes of the noodles as they land, trying to understand their meanings. Those focused weeks, racing to the looming finish line of a milestone, carefully balancing all of the minute details of your creations as you run. When you look back on it all, the collection of all those moments of varying intensities, the process of game development, stands out in your thoughts maybe nearly as much as the game does itself. Much of your day-to-day focus may be on ensuring an unforgettable experience for the player of the game you're making. But as the keeper of the process, the challenge bestowed on you is to ensure that the experience of game development is supportive, creative, and maybe even unforgettable too. You must bat away the encroaching thorny hedges and clear a walkway within which you and your team can build and make. To focus on the journey of game development, we need some tools at our disposal. But of course, I should probably introduce myself. I'm Sarah Shalley, an NPC on your quest. For me, the journey of whatever it is I'm making is often more enticing than the destination. I'm fortunate to have several different vantage points within the entertainment world. By day, I work in virtual production in the film industry. This is the corner of filmmaking that utilizes game engines and often aspects of motion capture and XR as part of the process of filmmaking. Basically, I see my role in virtual production as creating sandboxes for filmmakers to be more creative and playful with their movie making. I'm currently an Unreal software developer at a live-action visual effects company called Scanline VFX. Before that, I worked at DreamWorks Animation on the Advanced Creative Technology team, where I contributed to feature films like How to Train Your Dragon: The Hidden World, Trolls, Trolls World Tour, and Kung Fu Panda 3. I worked on XR projects, like our Fly with Toothless project with the indoor skydiving company iFly. I was proud to file a patent related to digital character interaction in a theme park that fuses the digital and physical worlds together. My background is also in game producing and design. I was a producer on Outer Wilds. I am also currently game directing and producing an adventure game with my independent studio, Tinted Stardust. I especially see my niche in the game development world as translating a creative vision into concrete steps for execution, making sure that all details from top to bottom are in line with the desired experience. Play and creating experiences have always been important to me, regardless of whether the people I'm creating the experience for are guests at a theme park, players playing at home, filmmakers figuring out a shot, or artists preparing their assets. Surely, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the members of your party who will be accompanying you on your adventure. Those warriors of Maya, the wizards of the spreadsheet, ninjas of the debugger. Each one has their responsibilities and expertise, their tools of the trade, and their magic powers that will help your party succeed on its journey. But sometimes I've found that team members can get pretty siloed into the roles they have been assigned. And sometimes it is implicitly understood that this group of people is called technical and that group called creative. I challenge you, as keeper of the process, to look beyond the segmented roles and unlock the hidden talents and unique perspectives that each of your party members are carrying with them that may not fit within their given responsibilities. Invite each discipline to think of ways that their own role can be technical and creative. Encourage blue sky brainstorming about tool functionality and playful experimentation in tech demos. Encourage team members to offer their opinions, ask questions, share their wealth of knowledge, and learn from each other. You're included in this too, O Process Guardian. Remember that creativity and technical know-how aren't finite resources. The process itself is merely the design of a game called game development. And for those of you embarking on a solo quest, I understand that the lines between your roles are already blurry enough, but encourage yourself to think creatively in those technical situations that appear before you, and to think technically in those creative scenarios. So I encourage you to approach the process of game development like a game. I think of it like a loose form of D&D, where your role is both as DM and as a player of the game. And your team members may be players of the game, but they too are frequently involved in the metagame, contributing to its design, like one of my favorite card games, Flux, where adapting to changing rules and objectives is your gameplay. But if game development is a game, then I propose that you consider that it has its own magic circle. It has its rules, objectives, hazards, lore. Your team has a shared narrative that it is creating together that couldn't exist in quite the same way outside the magic circle. But why bother? What does it affect to carry this metaphor with you? Even if you never speak about this idea or act on it in any specific way, my hope is that internalizing this concept will infuse your work with an underlying sense of creativity and joy. And if you allow your fellow team members to join you in the magic circle, you are demonstrating that experimenting with new ideas is okay, that making mistakes is okay, that thinking outside the box is okay, that being proud of your team's accomplishments is okay. Your team is on this journey together. Why not foster an environment where iteration is acceptable, critique is welcomed, and collaboration rules? And though it may seem obvious, including your team in the creation of your process makes sure your team is included in the process you create. You aren't creating a process in a vacuum and trying to stretch it onto the team after the fact. Your team will be much more likely to buy in and participate in a process that they helped create themselves. You will all create something that actually works for your team and your situation in particular. It lays out a common language across your team, making it safe to ask each other questions about how something works or to show each other half-functional experiments. Though this may seem like a daunting endeavor, remember that the player base of your process is pretty limited. Your experience only needs to work for a known sample set of people in controlled situations. And as one that holds the process, displaying curiosity and creativity models the culture you'd like to see from the others you work with. And to me, being part of a collaborative team with a buzzing creative energy is incredibly fulfilling. You're lucky, adventurer. To design this metagame, you have in your backpack a surplus of gizmos and gadgets, the designer's tools of the trade. Let's start with the concept of play. Play is joyful, spontaneous. Play is rehearsal, trying out something without committing to it. When kids play together, they jump into the scenario they are playing with their whole bodies. Much of virtual production and motion capture and filmmaking exists to foster this kind of play. It uses play to answer questions and solve problems in a tactile way. Here's an example from the virtual production world. You're a filmmaker and you have a freshly designed desert island environment. You want to know how many characters fit comfortably onto this island set piece without it feeling crowded. So you might have a handful of people on your team put on mocap suits and walk into the space. Then you can pick up a virtual camera, a physical camera with a screen on it, displaying the perspective into the digital world, and move through the space, experimenting with the kinds of shots you might want to create. You have an immediate ability to iterate. You can move the camera here and ask your volunteers to scoot over there. Maybe seagulls are really important to the sequence, and you can tie them to physical toys and fly them through the space. You can jump into the digital world and scale up a tree or delete it. The great thing about virtual production are the happy accidents that occur when it is frictionless to try out a possibility. Your team may not have access to a mocap system, but maybe instead you could figure out how an important environment might feel to move through and exist in by taping out its dimensions on the floor and adding chairs, pillows, cardboard boxes for important landmarks. Then you can get your team members to move through the physical space and play through the important moments. Make it easy for someone to push a chair around and suggest that this encounter move to this corner. If you're making a 2D platformer, you could turn a space into giant graph paper or use chalk outside. Cut out pieces of cardboard to represent moving platforms. Maybe use beanbags to represent locations of hazards. Physically jump across the platforms or act out some of the moments to better understand the timing, spacing, or possibilities. Maybe you'll come up with hazards you hadn't thought of, or get a clearer mental picture across your team of what the game will be like. It's tactile, physical, playful, and something that will stick in your mind. You just may come up with some of your best ideas by acting them out physically. And it's something your team can do together and can think back to as development continues. And hopefully, it can bring a sense of wide-eyed wonder to your work and to the experience you ultimately create for your players. I'm a big believer in physical decoration. Pinning reference images all around the workspace can immerse your team in inspiration as you work. Having toys and Legos around nearby allow for spontaneous visual demonstrations or figuring out key issues. For example, I have definitely picked up the plushies on my desk and used them to help me through some tricky coordinate system rotations. Just having these sorts of elements around encourages this kind of spontaneous play. And even if everyone is fully remote, I encourage you to think through ways to replicate these sorts of ideas digitally. Visually decorate your Trello board with colors lifted from your key art. Maybe use something like Tabletop Simulator to act out something together, or draw together on digital whiteboards. Role-play your dialogue to test out versions. One team member could be an NPC and another could act as the player. Play in any way you can. To a designer, mechanics are the building blocks of the game. They are the verbs, the actions that carry the player through your worlds. The verbs of your process could be words like export, review, save. What kinds of workflows will you be taking on? Let's say you're looking at an animation workflow. You have an animator hand animating some cycles on an already rigged character that need to get completed, approved, and then brought into the engine. Think about the workflow from end to end. Identify the input and output to the process and list out the mechanics that will be undertaken. The input to this workflow might be a character rig that's ready to be animated and a description of the action that needs to be animated. The output could be an animation deposited into the engine, ready to be integrated into the game. Breaking it down, we might list that the animator receives their task, maybe reviews some guides and reference, opens their software, imports all their needed files, makes sure everything's conforming to technical requirements. Maybe there's an intermediary step to retarget. And after this prep, the animator can then animate. Then they need to put it in front of someone for approval. Then maybe they receive some revision notes and jump back to animate. There might be another conforming process. And finally, export. If your team hasn't yet stumbled through the workflow from end to end, start with, say, a trivial test animation to iron out the quirks. You will likely realize there are whole sections that haven't been defined. I encourage your team to do this, even if you are missing a key specialized technician, like you don't yet have an animator. At least attempt a version of the process, skipping over the specialized steps that you may not know yet. The first step is defining the major chunks of the workflow, which will shed light on obvious inefficiencies that can be immediately fixed or murky areas that need to be clarified. Then you can start looking for ways to streamline the process further. What are the parts the animator hates doing? What are the parts that are really finicky or error-prone? Which parts are the least creative? I find that the best candidates for improving a process are the seams between disciplines, bringing work in and out of a software package and setting up a work environment, the mise en place. In this example, I point out the conforming steps. These are often really annoying and specific, and missing any of these could cost your team a lot of time further down the pipe. This could be a good place to start. Prioritize quick scripts that wrap these steps up by renaming joints, rehierarching, or adding proper namespacing. Then, if you have more time for streamlining the workflow, I would look at areas that show up in other workflows. In this case, I would point to the submitting work for review. You likely want to come up with one review process that will work for any of the types of work that may need to be reviewed. Maybe you can make a Trello card template that always includes relevant fields that you can aggregate. Maybe you can utilize a Slack Trello software integration that spawns a card when you type a keyword. Whatever it is, your team will learn the mechanics of submitting work generally, and when a new workflow arises, no one will be surprised if this mechanic makes an appearance again. Then, if you want to automate other portions, I would look for the chunks that always repeat in the same way every time the workflow occurs. For example, importing the proper files into the project. Your team could write a tool that automatically pulls in the needed files for the character, saving the animator from having to browse a tree of folders, trying to find which rig is the one that's ready for them. You could write an exporter button that saves the files into the desired folder with the proper naming convention, saving headaches later on. I know, sometimes it seems extraneous. When the team is pressed for time, does it make sense to write all of these tools? Personally, I think investing the time to streamline these sorts of annoyances now will save a lot of pain later. So many times have I been in situations where my team decided not to do this, where we felt so rushed that we skipped automation, or never actually defined our workflows from a high level. It was just go, go, go. But if we had just spent even a day or two to step back, think through, and quickly automate some of rough patches, we would have saved ourselves so much time later, and then given ourselves a better starting point for all kinds of workflows we inevitably would be undertaking. Even if you don't have the resources to do anything fancy, just defining the process workflow up front and identifying the various boxes around each action will help it be clearer to follow for everyone involved. Ask your team for ideas and input. They will be much more likely to buy in if they were consulted on the process. Constraints are so helpful for designing a game. They help narrow down amorphous tangles of ideas into something manageable. For your process, your constraints are your external deadlines, your budget, the expertise of people on your team. I'll add your pillars to this list as another very helpful constraint. I personally focus on experiential pillars, something like your choices deeply affect your relationships with the supporting characters, or express yourself through reconfiguration of the world around you. Coming up with 3 to 4 pillars early in development with your team about the kind of experience you want to create for your player is yet another example of a shared language. These words now mean something unique to your team that your team can always refer back to. It transcends disciplines. It reminds you to keep all elements across disciplines working towards the same goal. As you move through development, bring those pillars up in every avenue. For example, with the reconfiguration pillar, there could be a discussion about how the soundscape could morph as the world is reconfigured. Or perhaps the reconfigurations were so impactful they even seep into your settings menus. These constraints are so helpful for narrowing down what is and isn't in the possibility space of the game. For the choices affect relationships pillar, you understand that focusing on ensuring the dialogue system is rich and easy to use may be more important than focusing on making a process of procedural set dressing rich, for example. So maybe you can focus on streamlining the process of adjusting dialogue options. Maybe you can invest time into the development of a markup language for writers to specify how lines of dialogue affect emotions while working in the medium they are comfortable with. You could make pre-visualization mechanisms for how the dialogue choices affect the characters, like maybe a debugger-like standalone app for the writer to step through each line of dialogue and display emotional status visually as little bars of relevant characters while they write. Even if the final game displays none of this directly, the processes you have focused on are in service to those pillars you've created. Prototyping is so important to a designer. Cutting out pieces of paper and modeling individual systems can clarify so many unknowns and solve so many problems. But you can even paper prototype your process. Why do you prototype for a game? To experiment with a system without investing the resources, to try it without trying it. For the process, you've figured out what works and what doesn't work before going through the effort of actually implementing custom tools or setting up whole pipelines. Maybe draw a mock-up of potential tools on paper, focusing on ensuring that all needed actions are exposed. Hand it to someone who will be using that tool alongside a scenario to enact. Like, you've just been assigned a new animation for this character. Go. Have them walk through what they'd click on in the tool, when they'd even use it, what they think would happen when they click a given button. Think of more challenging, potentially stressful events to include in this playtest, like the character rig just changed and you need to pick up the changes, or you've just received notes and you need to redo this section. To find out if there's any confusion over the process or what happens running the tool multiple times. It's much easier to talk through these challenging scenarios when emotions aren't running high and you aren't racing against the clock. Some versions of playtests could just be quick hypothetical walkthrough discussions. But for more involved processes, some playtests could include test attempts at the work itself. Like any good playtest, remember you are welcome to Wizard of Oz it, fake through parts that don't exist yet, or use manual processes to represent what would happen when something is automated. It's like cooking show logic. You give me the uncooked casserole, and I give you back a pre-made cooked one representing what happened after you clicked the buttons. This, of course, doesn't necessarily have to be you doing the prototyping. Whoever will be creating the process is the best person to think through this and playtest their findings. Encourage constructive criticism and open dialogue. Help all team members feel involved in the processes that are being created, and get everyone comfortable giving and receiving critique. So you have many items in your inventory, adventurer. But of course, the types of processes that are relevant change over the course of the lifetime of a project. When you're very early in a project, you may not yet know the specifics of the workflows you're creating. You may not even know the game you are creating yet. Instead, this may be the right time to encourage play that sparks inspiration for concepts and brings the team together. Pin those inspiring images to the walls, or make Pinterest boards. Organize a Lego building afternoon for everyone with a relevant building theme related to the team or the game you're making. Lay out the creations and take portraits and display them in a Lego art exhibit with little plaques to remind you of all the cool things you created. Encourage learning and collaborating by hosting skill sharing days, where team members can teach each other something the others have been interested to learn. This could be a getting to know you activity where team members teach something personal, or it could be an opportunity for cross-training on specific workflows that perhaps were used extensively for your team's last game. You can hold show and tells, where each team member presents some highlights of their work on the game so far, or tells a story about a challenge they undertook. You could make this a team ritual that lingers on throughout development. Go on research outings or virtual visits to immerse yourselves in a topic. I've gone to local museum exhibits to inspire UI design, wandered around a bookshop to explore its layout. They don't have to be expensive excursions. If you're making a game about city life, maybe take a photographic walk at lunch to immerse yourselves in street photography. Then display the pictures around the office or share them digitally to remind yourselves of the field trip. Maybe host D&D sessions together in the world of the game to get everyone inspired and in the right headspace. Give your team shared moments to draw back on. When team members find themselves in the slog of development, they can look at the reference and be reminded of the time early in production when the ideas were fresh. As all the specifics become clearer and your journey moves towards the middle, you might be able to prototype more granular workflows and specify those mechanics for different processes. You don't necessarily need to have all your processes ironed out immediately. Let some of them happen organically, and as you go, you can figure out what works and what can be improved. Encourage your team to playtest their ideas and build sandboxes to experiment. For instance, if a programmer is thinking through a physics system, perhaps they could create a little tech demo tossing game with different variables exposed at runtime for tuning the behavior. Then they could hand this to someone else and have them play and see how it all feels. As tasks are figured out, be clear where there is room for experimentation. Which aspects are already set in stone from previous decisions? What are question marks? Uncertain? Which are likely to change? This will help the person understand where they might be able to come up with ideas for alternatives, or where their work should be quick and sketchy, just prototyping a portion of an idea versus creating a final production version. Be clear about any external constraints so they can better focus their efforts. Encourage an environment where iteration is welcomed. Late in the project, your deadlines are creeping in as your primary constraints, and there is dwindling room for iteration. Maybe structure a meeting to include a pre-decided 15 minutes of brainstorming or whiteboarding ideas for solving a given problem. Even though everyone is focused on going off and completing the problem, talking through hypotheses together may unify your efforts. This is a good time to focus on accomplishments. Have mini celebrations to play the build together, maybe comparing it with the build from earlier in a milestone to remind everyone of how far it has come. Have a thermometer of progress on a poster board or digitally that you fill in as you complete work. 60% of VFX has been finished. Send out gifs of cool bits of work or problems solved to let other team members stay aware of the cool stuff that's going on. Like, we finally fixed the crash bug. It may be a good distraction when someone is stuck tracking down the most hard-to-find issues or doing last-minute revisions. No matter where you are in the timeline of your journey, try to squeeze in little bits of play and celebration wherever you can. But before you are unleashed off into the world, I want to offer a word of warning. Beware of getting too stuck on a process just because it's there, or because it's something you set up previously. I have definitely fallen into this trap. I found myself focusing an enormous amount of energy maintaining cumbersome processes that clearly weren't working for my team, thinking that by undertaking them, I was being objectively productive. I should have climbed out of the weeds enough to realize how the processes were fitting in with the bigger picture. Be okay with iterating on your process and ask your team for critique. Showing that you are willing to iterate on processes that need to be changed will also help your team be willing to iterate on their own ideas. Approach changes to your process the same way you approach changes to feature requests. Examine them, analyze them, assess their impact, and implement what works. When you're making your game's schedule, remember this iteration time. And if you build in time for failed experiments across the board, then you're right on schedule when you fail the experiments. Game development is a journey. As keeper of that process, you have the noble responsibility of sculpting that journey into something memorable and supportive. I am enthusiastic to see where the journey takes you, adventurer. Thank you.